We're headed straight into week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season, which means we are headed straight into the first week of the 2024 fantasy football playoffs. So you know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to break down our must-start defenses and streams moving into the week to help you guys dominate week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 15 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards this week's action. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards this week's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Let's kick the video off with the Denver Broncos, who are coming in at 61% rostered. They have dropped a little bit, and obviously we're on bye week this past week in week 14. But this has been one of the best defensive units in fantasy football all season long, coming in as a defense 2 so far on the season. They had 10 or more fantasy points in each of their last 3 games, and their second best fantasy performance in week 13 against Cleveland. Although they gave up 552 total yards and 32 total points, they still had 3 sacks in that game, 3 interceptions, and 2 of those pick sixes from Jameis Winston, right? So on the season, they've been fantastic. 47 sacks, 7 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, 12 interceptions, 4 defensive touchdowns. And like I said, that roster percentage has dropped a bit, and I do think that they are a good play this week against Anthony Richardson and the Indianapolis Colts. Now, I don't think Richardson's just going to come out here and be a complete fluke or anything, but he has had a string of turnovers in his past 3 starts. 2 fumbles, a lost fumble in week 11, a fumble in week 12 against Detroit. That was not a lost fumble, but he didn't play great in that game per se. Then in week 13, 2 interceptions. So we've seen on the season that there's turnover upside for defenses who are playing Anthony Richardson. What I also like is that this is a home game for the Broncos. It is tough to travel out to Denver and put together a fantastic game. I mean, don't get me wrong, plenty of teams do it, but it is a tough environment, elevation, all that stuff to go out and travel to. So I think this is another solid week for the Denver Broncos. Safe floor this week. And like I said, I think some people maybe will lose a little bit of faith because the following weeks aren't as strong, as they're going to play the Chargers in week 16 and then get the Bengals in week 17, and then they had the bye week this past week. So there's definitely a chance that they got dropped in your respective league. So go out and check. I think they're one of the safest plays this week. And honestly, while I think their upside is very limited in week 16 and 17, still think they could come through with okay performances against the Chargers and Bengals, but I don't know if I'm risking it against the Bengals. But here in week 15, if you own the Broncos, keep rolling with them. If they're out there on waivers, pick them up. They're a strong start for the first week of the fantasy playoffs. But speaking of strong starts, let's quickly go over the Minnesota Vikings, who have basically made every single video here on the season. They do sit at 91% rostered, and they did come through with a bit of a lower ceiling performance this past week with 7 fantasy points, allowed 21 total points. They had just 1 sack. They did have 2 interceptions, so they have had 5 interceptions in their last 4 games. I mean, this is still one of the best run defenses in the NFL. They're very good against the pass. And here in week 15, look at the Chicago Bears. Now, you look, the last time they played the Bears, they had just 7 fantasy points, allowed 27 total points, 3 sacks, a forced fumble, and that was it in that matchup. But I think that this matchup against the Bears this week could be a little bit better at home and provide a little bit more upside for the Vikings defense this week. Caleb Williams was fine this past week, but the Bears did struggle against the Niners. He threw 2 touchdowns, but just 134 passing yards, 27 yards on the ground. No interceptions, but he did have a lost fumble. And it is worth noting, I mean, Caleb Williams has not had an interception since week 6 of the season, and in interesting fashion against the Jaguars of all teams. So I don't think that the Vikings are necessarily a high upside play. But what I do want to say is that I still think that they are startable. Don't be going out here and starting these bottom barrel teams because you just want to drop the Vikings. They're still the defense one on the season so far, ahead of the Broncos, who we just talked about. They get Geno Smith in week 16. I don't know if I love them against Jordan Love in the fantasy playoffs, but what I do want to say is that if you're looking at what's out there and there's just nothing, which I will also say we're going to go over some teams today that are probably going to be out there in terms of streaming options. But if you're stuck with the Vikings, don't act like it's a bad thing. They're going to provide a safe floor, 7, 8, 9 points, and they always have turnover upside on a weekly basis. So if the Vikings are your team, don't be afraid to roll with them. But maybe some of these streaming options coming up you might prefer as we get into week 15. All right, and speaking of the Vikings, let's talk about the team that they beat this past week. That's the Atlanta Falcons, who had 0 fantasy points against the Vikings. They allowed 42 total points. They had 4 sacks, no turnovers, allowed 433 total yards. And they obviously sit at just 10% rostered. But they had a good game in week 13 against the Chargers with 13 fantasy points, 5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery. Only allowed 187 yards in that game, right? And now I think this is going to be a hot streaming option over the next 2 weeks because they're going to go a little under the radar because they got torched by Sam Darnold, Jordan Addison, 3 touchdowns, Justin Jefferson, 2 touchdowns. They're already only at 10% rostered. But they get Desmond Ridder in week 15 unless Gardner Minshew rises from the grave or the Raiders sign a different quarterback. Great matchup there. Then in week 16, they get Drew Lock or Tommy DeVito or whoever else is on the Giants roster at quarterback. So they are going to be a legit streaming option over the next 2 weeks. So ignore what they did in week 14. Ignore what they did in weeks 11, 10, and 9, where they combined for 1 fantasy point, right? Listen, this is a little bit of a risky play, but there's tons of upside here. The quarterback matchups are fantastic in weeks 15 and 16, and I truly believe that the Falcons over the next 2 weeks could be one of the best streaming options in terms of defensive units in fantasy football. I don't like them on the road against Washington in the fantasy championship, but for weeks 15 and 16, you have great quarterback matchups and plenty of turnover upside. And the Falcons only sit at 10% rostered. They could be a very good streaming option as we get in to the first round of the fantasy playoffs. And next up, we got the Jacksonville Jaguars sitting at 6% rostered, and they came through with a big performance in week 14, 10 fantasy points, allowed just 6 total points, 2 sacks, and 1 forced fumble against Will Levis and the Tennessee Titans. I mean, double-digit fantasy points is fantastic for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And if you guys watch the playoff streaming video for defenses that I put out last Saturday, we talked about the Jaguars, also talked about the Falcons, right? And the Jaguars, surprisingly, in week 9 against the Eagles had 10 fantasy points. In week 10 against the Vikings had 11 fantasy points. It's pretty bad the following 2 weeks against the Lions and the Texans as they combined for 2 fantasy points, but they have a pretty legit playoff schedule. As a matter of fact, you could argue the Jaguars have the best playoff schedule for any defense as we wrap up the fantasy season. They get Aaron Rodgers and the Jets at home in week 15. It could go very badly. It could go great. Who knows what you're going to get out of the Jets on a weekly basis. Then the following week, they get Desmond Ridder and the Las Vegas Raiders or whoever's going to be playing quarterback. It's going to be a good matchup, I guarantee you that. Then in week 17, they get Will Levis and the Tennessee Titans again. They sit at just 6% rostered. No, they have not been a good defense this year. But over the past couple of weeks, they have been a little bit better than you might think if you take away that complete beatdown against the Detroit Lions. So this is one of those teams. You're looking for upside. You're looking for a streaming option. I think that they could legitimately finish with double-digit points in every game for the rest of the season. The Jets is my least favorite matchup, but there's definitely potential there given the state of that offense and that team right now, although they showed a lot of fight against the Dolphins. But then those following 2 weeks against the Raiders and the Titans, there's a lot of upside here for this Jaguars defensive unit. They could wrap up the season in very nice fashion. Next up, let's talk about the Baltimore Ravens, who are on bye week this past week. They sit at 48% rostered. And they've only averaged 5.7 fantasy points per game on the season. And this has been a defense that I've been pretty vocal about disliking when it comes to fantasy football. They're the defense 21 on the season. They only have double digits in 2 games on the season, against the Bills in week 4 and against the Broncos in week 10. But here in week 15, they're going to be a streaming option because they're going to get Drew Lock or Tommy DeVito. I don't know if the Giants are going to make a quarterback change. Who knows? I keep saying that, but it'll probably be Drew Lock, and that's going to leave plenty of turnover upside, as we've seen in the past 2 weeks, with an interception in each of Drew Lock's first 2 starts, and then a lost fumble in week 13 as well. So listen, there are definitely questions about this Ravens secondary. They've been banged up throughout the season, but they are good against the run, and Drew Lock is going to be no match for this Ravens team at the end of the day. So while they have been a very disappointing defense, to say the least, on the season, they still sit at just, or surprisingly, at 48% roster, even having a bye week this past week, which surprises me. I mean, maybe people were looking ahead to week 15 and holding on to them, because then they get the Steelers and the Texans, which are like maybe okay matchups, but definitely not fantastic matchups. And I don't know if I see double-digit potential there. But here in week 15 against the Giants, the Ravens are a viable play. Sitting at 48% roster, they might be out there in your respective league. They have plenty of upside, plenty of turnover potential, and are a strong start on the road against the Giants. And last but not least, let's talk about the Washington Commanders, also on bye week this past week, sitting at 32% rostered, and they've only averaged 5.9 fantasy points per game on the season. But we also now know that Derek Carr has an injury to his non-throwing hand, believed to be a fractured hand. So that's probably going to leave Derek Carr out in week 15. It might stifle the rest of his season. So who are we going to see in week 15? Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler? It is hard to say. I would imagine it will be Jake Haener, actually, because Spencer Rattler was inactive this past week and downgraded to an emergency quarterback. But regardless here, we've got plenty of upside in terms of the Commanders' defense this week. I think I need to break that down too extensively, whether it's Haener or Rattler. These are pretty bottom barrel quarterbacks in terms of starting quarterbacks in the league. No offense to both of those guys, but the turnover potential will be there, and the overall offense is definitely going to struggle, given that they don't really have any healthy players on this team, it seems, right? No Taysom Hill. I know Jawan Jennings stepped up this past week. MBS has had some flashes. We've talked a lot about him. And obviously, Alvin Kamara is still around. We even saw Kendre Miller score a touchdown this past week. But yeah, this team feels very decimated, and that's been part of their issue all season long, since we saw, that kind of run early in the season where they looked fantastic. But nonetheless, here, lots of turnover potential for the Commanders this week. And I don't think we need to break that down too extensively. I think most people are going to look at this and say, yeah, the Commanders, even though they haven't been very good, the defense 19 on the season, they got plenty of upside this week. As this week, it's a tough matchup in week 16 against the Eagles, but the following week in the fantasy playoffs, they get the Falcons. Maybe it'll be Michael Penix. Maybe it'll stay as Kirk Cousins. And if it's Cousins, 8 interceptions, a handful of fumbles, 0 touchdowns in the past couple weeks. There's going to be some turnover potential there as well. So, bottom line is, Commanders, I guarantee you, will be a top streaming option going into the week due to the non-existent quarterback for the New Orleans Saints and the state of this entire offense and all the injuries. They're only 32% rostered. They got a ton of upside, and they are a strong streaming option going in to the first round of the fantasy playoffs. And that'll do it for today's video. There are your must-start defenses and streams moving into week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions throughout the entire week as I possibly can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the first round of the fantasy playoffs, drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can. But more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have every single thing you could possibly need daily here on the channel to help you guys dominate the rest of the fantasy season and the fantasy playoffs. So make sure you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.